The blood on his hands never seemed to wash away completely. Ikenna stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, scrubbing his fingers raw under the hot water. No matter how hard he scrubbed, he could still smell it, the metallic scent that clung to him like a shadow. At 23, he had already killed more people than he could count. They called him Sniper in the underworld. And when that name was whispered in the dark corners of town, grown men trembled. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the blood seemed heavier on his conscience. He dried his hands and walked to his bedroom window, looking out at the city below. Somewhere out there, people were living normal lives, returning from work, kissing their children goodnight, planning their futures. Ikenna envied them. He had never known what it felt like to sleep peacefully through the night without nightmares haunting him in his dreams. He would give anything for a simple life at the moment. His phone buzzed. A text from Amadi. Come to the house right now. Ikenna's jaw tightened. Amadi, popularly known as the Hammer in the underworld, was the only father he had ever known. Amadi was the man who had found him on the streets 14 years ago, bloody and broken, with no memory of his past or who he was. He had trained him to become the perfect killing machine. When Amadi called, Ikenna answered. He always did. Amadi's mansion stood out with its stone walls. Guards nodded respectfully as Ikenna's black Mercedes passed through the gates. Even here, in Amadi's own home, people feared him. It had been that way for as long as he could remember, and he loved it. Amadi was waiting in his study, a tall man with graying hair and cold eyes that missed nothing. He looked up as Ikenna entered, his face expressionless as usual. Sit, Amadi commanded, sliding a folder across the desk. Ikenna opened it to find a photograph of a middle-aged couple. They were smiling at the camera, their arms around each other lovingly. The sight made something twist in Ikenna's chest. It felt a lot like envy, but he brushed it off. Mr. and Mrs. Ude, Amadi said. They need to be eliminated before sunrise, he added. Their address is on the back of the photo. Ikenna flipped the picture over and memorized the address. It was in a quiet residential area, the kind of neighborhood where children played in the streets and neighbors knew each other's names. He had passed by the neighborhood a few times before. Any security concerns? He asked, slipping the photo into his pocket. None. It should be a simple job, Amadi said, leaning back in his chair. Take Chooks with you. Ikenna nodded and walked away. By 11 p.m. that night, Ikenna was driving through the quiet streets towards the Ude's residence with Chooks beside him. His right-hand man was a short, slim guy with quick hands and a quicker smile. They had worked together for 8 years, and Chooks was one of the few people Ikenna trusted completely. His friendly face did a good job at masking how dangerous he actually was. You're quiet tonight, Chooks observed. Is something wrong? Ikenna just shook his head. The truth was, he had been having more and more of these moments lately. Times when he questioned what they were doing. Times when the faces of his victims haunted him even when he was still awake. But he pushed those thoughts away. This was his life. This was all he knew. The Ude's house was big with yellow walls. Ikenna observed the quiet environment. He watched as Chooks picked the lock of the back door. In a short while, the door was opened silently as Ikenna slipped inside. He made his way carefully through the kitchen into the hallway. He found Mr. and Mrs. Ude in the master bedroom, sleeping peacefully. The husband's arm was wrapped around his wife protectively. For a moment, Ikenna hesitated. These people had done nothing to him, but a job was a job. It was over quickly and silently. Ikenna was about to leave when he heard soft footsteps behind him. He spun around to find a young woman walking towards the kitchen. She was wearing a long red nightgown. Ikenna could hear his heart racing. The woman stopped in her tracks. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice soft and curious rather than frightened. Ikenna froze. She was beautiful. He reached for his gun, but she didn't flinch. She seemed so calm, so unafraid of as if finding a stranger in her house was the most natural thing in the world. "Are you daddy's guest?" she asked when he didn't answer. Ikenna found himself nodding, though he didn't know why. He should have been moving, eliminating the witness, getting out of there, but he couldn't seem to move his legs. She stepped closer, and that was when he noticed it. The way she moved carefully, her hands trailing along the wall for guidance. She was blind. "Are you hurt?" she asked gently, stopping just in front of him. "You smell like blood." Her question shocked Ikenna. No one had ever asked if he was injured. No one had cared enough to notice his pain, physical or otherwise. He was the sniper. Everyone knew he would be fine no matter what life tossed his way. Before he could respond, she had disappeared into what looked like a small storage closet and returned with a first aid kit, leading him to the couch. Her father had mentioned that he would be hosting a guest not much older than her, the son of a business partner who would be staying for a few days. But she had gone to bed early and hadn't been awake to receive the visitor. At least, that was what she thought. Ikenna switched on a small table lamp. In the soft glow, he could see her face clearly now. She was even more beautiful than he had first thought, with smooth, dark skin. There was a fading scar on her forehead, but even the scar seemed to add to her beauty. Knowing that the light might attract Chuk's attention from outside where he stood guard, Ikenna quickly sent a text telling him to wait for him in the car while he cleaned up the scene. He knew Chooks would be confused, since cleaning up wasn't Ikenna's job, but his partner would follow others without question. That was one of the many things he liked about his friend. The young woman had taken his hand and was gently examining it for injuries. There were none, of course, but she carefully cleaned and bandaged a small scratch he hadn't even noticed. Ikenna felt guilty for this small act of kindness. He watched carefully as she replaced the items back into the first aid box. "What's your name?" she asked as she worked. "Ikenna," he found himself saying, though every instinct screamed at him to stay silent. She smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through clouds. "I'm Joy. It's nice to meet you, Ikenna." Joy. The name fit her perfectly, he thought. Too bad he wouldn't be bringing her any joy tonight. Ikenna stuck a needle in her neck and pressed, with one hand covering her mouth. Seconds later, Joy was lying motionless beside him. Ikenna watched Joy sleeping in his bed. He had brought her home with him despite Chuk's protests. She looked so peaceful. He felt like the peace she felt was being extended to him. As he watched the gentle rise and fall of her breathing, he imitated her, trying to match her soft breathing. Soon, he fell asleep. Ikenna woke up to Joy screaming. He had expected her to wake up scared. Ikenna tried to comfort her, but she fought him. In the days that followed, Joy refused to eat anything Ikenna brought. She spent the days crying and asking to be taken back home. Ikenna felt something shifting in his heart each day he came home to see Joy looking worse than before he left. He had attended her parents' funeral on her behalf. He sat at the back of the packed church and listened to speaker after speaker talk about their kindness, their generosity, how good they were. The grief in the room was overwhelming, and Ikenna felt like he was drowning in it. Every night, he slept on the couch, letting Joy have the bed to herself. He would come home late when she was already asleep and would leave before she woke up. One night, while Ikenna slept, he had nightmares as usual. He trembled and cried in his sleep. But something was different this time. A gentle voice called his name, shaking him awake. He saw Joy hunched over him. The look of worry was evident on her face. It was then he realized that he had fallen asleep and it was all just a dream. Her hand was on his shoulder, squeezing gently as if to comfort him. And for the first time in his life, Ikenna felt vulnerable. He took her in his arms and hugged her tightly. She didn't hug him back, but neither did she push him away. After a few minutes, he let her go, standing up to leave the room. He looked at the bedside clock. It was 5 a.m. He had come home after midnight and must have fallen asleep shortly after. He was shocked because he had never slept for 5 hours before. Over the next couple of days, Ikenna began to spend more time with Joy. He would ask her questions about her parents, her life, carefully avoiding any questions about himself. She talked to him about her parents' businesses, her hobbies, her friends, her school life, and her daily activities before she was taken. The more he learned about her, the more he warmed up to her. One day, while he was listening to her speak, Joy suddenly asked him if her parents were dead. Ikenna couldn't bring himself to give her a response. However, she understood his silence. She asked him again if he had something to do with their death. Again, he didn't answer, but he could tell she understood what he hadn't said. He knew she would ask someday, so it didn't come to him as a surprise. What surprised him, however, was her calm voice when she asked why he did it. He could see the tears gathering in her eyes. He paused for a minute and couldn't come up with a suitable answer, so he told her it was his job. She nodded quietly as she cried. Ikenna threw himself into research. He tried to understand why the Udays had been targeted. They seemed like genuinely good people. They donated to charities, treated their employees well, and were beloved in their community. So why had Amadi wanted them dead? His research didn't find anything useful. They had no enemies, no business disputes, no reason that anyone would want them dead. Everything changed 3 weeks later when Amadi summoned Ikenna. When Ikenna arrived at the mansion, Chooks was there, sitting uncomfortably in Amadi's office. His partner wouldn't meet his eyes, and Ikenna's blood ran cold. When Amadi offered him a seat, he declined, choosing to stand. Chooks tells me you brought home a souvenir from the Uday job, the old man began. Ikenna's hands moved instinctively towards his gun, but he forced himself to remain still. I don't know what you mean, he replied calmly. The daughter, where is she? There was no point in lying now. Amadi had a habit of asking questions he already knew the answer to. Ikenna pleaded with Amadi to spare the girl. He explained that she wasn't a threat, and that he would kill her himself if she proved to be a threat. The old man smiled, a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. Of course, son. Do as you wish, said Amadi as he waved Ikenna away. Immediately he stepped out of the office, Ikenna ran to his car. He could hear Chooks following, but he didn't stop to look back. Joy was in danger. He could feel it. He drove like a madman across the city, his heart pounding as he imagined what Amadi's men might already be doing to her. When he burst through his apartment door, he found them already there, three of Amadi's best men. Joy was nowhere to be found. The fight was brutal. These men had been trained by the same person who had trained Ikenna, and they knew all his moves, but they had never fought with the desperation of a man protecting the only thing in the world that mattered to him. When it was over, Ikenna was bleeding from a dozen wounds, but he was alive, and Joy was safe. He found her trembling in the wardrobe, her hand covering her mouth as she cried silently. In that moment, Ikenna felt something he had never experienced before. The fierce protective love that would make him burn down the world to keep her from harm. He took her by the arm and ran. He knew it wasn't over. Amadi wasn't the type to give up after the first try. The next few weeks were the hardest of Ikenna's life. They moved from hotel to hotel, never staying in one place for more than a night or two. Amadi's men were everywhere, and several times they barely escaped capture. Ikenna reached out to old contacts, people who owed him favors, but no one was willing to go up against the hammer. Amadi's reputation for cruelty was legendary, and the thought of crossing him terrified even the bravest criminals. One fateful day, while they were staying in a rundown motel on the outskirts of town, someone knocked on their door. Ikenna told Joy to hide in the bathroom and grabbed his gun, expecting the worst. Instead, he found his old friend standing in the doorway, looking miserable. "Don't shoot," Chooks said, raising his hands. "I'm here to help." Ikenna kept his gun pointed at him. Chooks explained that he felt bad for telling Amadi about Joy, but he hadn't expected that Amadi would try to kill Ikenna too, since Ikenna was like a son to him. But when Chooks saw that Amadi had placed a hit on both Joy and Ikenna, he regretted his decision. Ikenna had saved Chooks' life twice before in the past, and Chooks wanted to repay him. He pulled out a thick folder from his bag and set it on the bed. "I've been doing some digging into the Uday job. There's something you need to know," he said, hands still raised. Ikenna opened the folder and found documents, photographs, and what looked like investigation reports. Dropping his gun, he went through the contents of the folder. The names and pictures were all vaguely familiar. He examined the documents, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. There was a picture of a light-skinned man, about 40. The information at the back of the photograph said he was a private investigator. Ikenna remembered him. He had carried out that hit himself 3 weeks ago, thinking the man was just another target. He had never known why Amadi wanted him dead. He had never asked. "Every person in there is dead," Chooks said. "The investigator, the lawyer who was helping with the search, even a records clerk who had access to old birth certificates, all killed by us on Amadi's order." Ikenna sank into a chair, his mind reeling. "What does this have to do with the Udays?" he asked. At this point, Joy came out of the bathroom and stood before the two men discussing. She had heard enough to know it was safe to come out. "Everyone connected to the Udays have been killed." "Everyone except her," replied Chooks. And indeed, he was right. Everyone who could be connected to the Udays were dead, except Joy. But nothing about Joy was in the folder. Ikenna introduced Chooks to Joy. She greeted him politely. He was impressed at how calm she looked, even though she had just overheard them discussing murder like it was nothing. "Joy," Ikenna began, unsure how to start. "Did you know your parents were looking for someone?" he asked. She nodded in response. "Do you know who they were looking for?" Again, she nodded. "Can you tell me who?" Both men looked at her expectantly. Joy sat down on the bed, taking a deep breath as she began. 14 years ago, two families lived next door to each other. They were the best of friends. One family had a little boy who was about 9, and the other had a little girl 2 years younger than the boy. The children played together every day. Her voice grew soft with memory. One fateful afternoon, the children were playing in their secret hiding place, a small attic above the boys' room, when they heard raised voices from downstairs, shouting, screaming. Scared, both children remained in the attic until smoke began to fill the house. Ikenna's heart was pounding as she continued. The little girl's father's driver found them and helped them escape, but there was an accident as they fled. The girl woke up in the hospital to discover that she had lost her sight, and the boy had disappeared. She went on to explain how her mother had called her a few months ago to tell her that a private investigator they had hired had found out that the boy was alive, which was why she had come home from school, excited to reunite with her friend. The room was spinning around Ikenna. What she was narrating sounded familiar, a lot like his nightmares, being trapped in a small space, the smell of smoke, the pain as the smoke filled his lungs. Do you remember your mother's friend's name? Chooks asked. Joy sat silently for a while. God's son. I always called the boy God's son, she said with a smile. His surname was Nwachukwu. She added, Ikenna Nwachukwu. That's his name. Chooks and Ikenna's exchanged looks. That night, Ikenna couldn't fall asleep. Chooks had promised to continue digging for information. It couldn't be a coincidence, Ikenna thought. The hammer was Amadi Nwachukwu. Ikenna had always been grateful that Amadi had given him the surname Nwachukwu, a name the old man had never failed to remind him how fortunate he was to have. The memories came flooding back like a dam had burst in Ikenna's mind. Not the fractured nightmares that had haunted his sleep, but clear, vivid recollections of a life he had forgotten. His head hurt. He remembered a kind mother, a patient father. He wasn't sure if the memories were his or merely being created from Joy's stories, but they felt very real. Later that week, Chooks helped Ikenna organize a meeting with Mr. Thomas Owa, the head of operations at A&A Oil PLC. The company was owned by Amadi. It served as the cover for the rest of his illegal affairs. As Ikenna walked into the bar to meet Mr. Thomas, several questions were running through his mind. Chooks was already seated beside Mr. Thomas. The old man looked clearly uncomfortable in his grey suit that he left unbuttoned to accommodate his bulging stomach. His eyes darted around the dimly lit bar, as if afraid to be recognized. Thomas Uwa had worked for A&A Oil for 30 years, starting as a simple office assistant when Amadi's father first founded the company. He had watched Amadi take over, had seen him gradually eliminate anyone who might question his rights to leadership, and had kept silent for years out of fear. He was still afraid, but now Amadi had begun killing off anyone who had any idea of what had happened back then. News of families being wiped out in accidents and house fires among the old staff had become a regular occurrence. It was clear that Amadi was tying up loose ends. Thomas knew he was going to be next, sooner or later. The only way to save his life, and that of his family, was to take down Amadi. So when he had heard that Chooks was digging into the case, he reached out to him happily. Mr. Thomas' story was similar to Joy's, except that he explained the reason for the fire. Amadi had been disinherited when his father, Chief Nwachukwu, had learned about his illegal activities. To prevent his father from handing the family business over to his younger brother Ikenna, Amadi had killed his brother, setting it up as an accident. Chief Nwachukwu had died a few years later, and Amadi, being the only member of the Nwachukwu family still alive, had taken over A&A Oil. Ikenna listened attentively, asking Mr. Thomas questions about Amadi's brother. Thomas admitted that he had only met Ikenna a few times, but the man had left a good impression. He also told them that Ikenna had a son who had also been killed in the fire. The boy was said to be about 9 years old at the time. Ikenna asked if there was proof of all these things. Thomas assured him that he has had evidence, but he would only give it to him if he could ensure the safe relocation of him and his family out of the country. Rage filled Ikenna like nothing he had ever experienced, but alongside it came clarity. He looked at Chooks. He knew his best friend was thinking the same thing he was. It wasn't a coincidence that Amadi had given him the name Ikenna Nwachukwu when he found him. The name had always felt so natural because it was his name. Amadi wasn't his savior. He had been the one who ruined his life. The greatest shock of all was that Amadi was his uncle. Ikenna knew that if he faced Amadi head-on, he might never win the fight. So he came up with a plan. He would help relocate Mr. Thomas's family safely. But Thomas was to stay back and help him bring some board members over to his side. The source of Amadi's power was the money he had. A&A Oil was a multi-billion naira company. It had branches all over the world. Ikenna knew that if he could overthrow Amadi in the business field, he would stand a chance to defeat Amadi. The boardroom of A&A Oil was tense as the emergency meeting began. Amadi sat at the head of the long table, his usual confidence somewhat shaken. He hadn't been the one to call the meeting, so he didn't know what to expect. Around him sat the company's board of directors, key investors, and business partners, all people who had profited from their association with him over the years. Mr. Thomas stood up slowly, his hands shaking slightly. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice growing stronger with each word. His fears melted away slowly as he told the board members what Amadi had been up to, passing around evidence Chooks had retrieved. An order for a hit on one of the board members and his family. Pictures of the man and his family were passed around to the men seated. Behind the photograph was their address and instructions written in Amadi's handwriting. Amadi tried to deny it all, saying it was a setup, but majority of the board members already knew what Amadi was capable of. Although they had never supported his means, they had also never openly disapproved of it. That is, until now. Now, he has started killing off members of the board, those who he felt posed a threat to him and his position in the company. The more Thomas spoke, the more restless the elegantly dressed men appeared. Now, Amadi was openly nervous. He needed the trust of the board members for business to continue smoothly. Thomas ended with a suggestion of a vote for Amadi's removal as head of the company. After the vote was counted, 60% of the board members voted for Amadi to be removed. Mr. Thomas was then voted in as temporary head of the company. Amadi stormed out of the room furious. His phone buzzed. It was a message from one of his boys telling him they had found Ikenna. Finally, some good news, he thought. Amadi rushed off to the address. Ikenna was waiting for Amadi. He had expected it. It was raining bullets for a few minutes. Amadi had years of experience. Ikenna had desperation and vengeance on his side. When it was over, Amadi was still on the floor, and Ikenna stood over him, feeling not triumph, but a deep, overwhelming sadness. The man who had stolen everything from him was gone, but he didn't bring back his parents or erase the pain in his heart. He could hear the sound of Amadi's men in the distance. He took off through the back door, leaving the old man on the bloodied floor. It took 3 years before Ikenna was finally able to take over his grandfather's business. He stood at his office window, looking out. A&A Oil was no longer just a front for criminal activities. Under Ikenna's leadership, it had become one of the most respected energy companies, known for its ethical business practice and commitment to community development. They had built schools in rural areas, funded healthcare clinics, and provided scholarships for underprivileged children. It was the kind of company he felt his father would have been proud of. Joy, on her part, had relocated abroad to get her master's degree. Ikenna was sponsoring her studies. His love for her was growing stronger, but she still hadn't opened her heart to him. She was polite, maybe even caring on rare occasions. Ikenna wanted more, but he knew better than to push. He was willing to wait until she had healed enough to want him as much as he wanted her.